my personal belongings.
That's a New York City Housing Authority, or NYC employee, evicting a single mother Monday morning from the two-bedroom apartment at the Ingersoll Public Housing Development in downtown Brooklyn.
So evictions are now taking place more frequently across New York City during the dead of winter. But controversially, it's the city itself who's allowing people to get kicked out of its own affordable housing facilities with the help of private corporations. And to make matters even worse, this is all happening while 5,600 of these affordable units sit empty, collecting dust instead of rent during the worst housing crisis New York's experienced in decades.
The city's biggest landlord is currently carrying more than 5,600 vacancies across its portfolio. Mocha admits she'd been squatting in the vacant unit with her young daughter for the last 4 months. She says before squatting, they lived in a city homeless shelter.
That apartment actually has been vacant for 5 years.
The building itself is pretty old. I mean, they're reinstalling new pipes and stuff like that.
The little heat we get is going out the window, and they won't even give us new windows.
This is what you slept in last night?
Yeah.
They say some of the conditions are inhumane. They have photos of different shades of water they say continue to come out of their faucets, paint in their apartments that's peeling from the walls, and cabinets with no doors.
Mocha argues New York City has a housing shortage, her family is homeless, and NYC should be using its vast inventory of vacant apartments to house the homeless.
The heat is barely coming through here, and the heat that does make it through is going right through drafty windows. Neighbors here say they are frustrated, and we are working to get them some answers.
So after turning several public housing complexes over to private managers, evictions are skyrocketing. And while this is happening, nobody can live in the thousands of vacant apartments just sitting empty in the very same buildings people are being kicked out of. A situation that just adds to New York's growing homelessness epidemic instead of fixing it. During a time when sky-high rents, sky-high groceries, and apartment shortages are forcing many New Yorkers out on the streets, with some going so far as to live in our subway system in an attempt to escape bitter cold winter temperatures. And none of this makes any sense. We shouldn't have empty apartments during a housing crisis, and we certainly shouldn't be making people homeless during a homelessness epidemic. But that's exactly what's happening. And the most frustrating thing about this is that last year the city had just under 5,000 empty apartments which weren't being used. And during these dueling crises, that number has just gone up. At a time when there's a backlog of over 200,000 New Yorkers waiting for a spot to open up in public housing, who it seems are waiting around for no reason, as there are empty apartments right now they could live in, but instead those apartments sit vacant. And that brings us to the real reason why New York City is increasing the size of its homeless population while restricting the very supply of apartments that could help those in need. Nobody running these housing facilities cares if the people they're designed for benefit from them. And in spite of the fact that thousands are waiting for these apartments to open up, it still takes a staggering 400 days for a vacant apartment in New York public housing to get renovated and then re-rented to a new tenant. A process that private landlords who don't get government funding are able to accomplish in just a few days. But as you're about to see, the city seems to have no problem evicting people from these places at a much faster rate. So behind me, we've got a NYC public housing facility. NYC stands for New York City Housing Authority. It's the largest public housing authority in North America. And according to the city's website, NYC was created in 1935 to provide decent, affordable housing for low and moderate income New Yorkers. But as you can see, there are some big problems with the way these facilities are run that start at the front door and then work their way inside these facilities, where apparently you have thousands of vacant apartments nobody can live in.
Mocha admits she'd been squatting in the vacant unit with her young daughter for the last 4 months. She says before squatting, they lived in a city homeless shelter. You decided to move in here.
Yeah, absolutely, because at the end of the day, I still have my daughter.
So in this story, we've got a single mom who's getting evicted from one of these apartments, which apparently had been empty for a very long time. Now, this woman does admit to finding her way inside this vacant apartment and residing there without a lease, which would make her a squatter. Now, squatting is definitely not okay, but this just goes to show you how backwards and poorly managed these facilities are when they're full of empty apartments that could really help someone, and when someone who needs that help finds their way inside of one, they're not allowed to live there. Nobody is. That's crazy. And if you look around New York City, you'll notice pretty quickly that there are a lot of people who need a place to live. We've got people living in our subway, we've got people living in campers and cars outside of parks, and you've got thousands of people right now waiting in line for a place like this, and they're told nothing's available and they have to keep waiting.
Tenants here at the Ingersoll houses tell us that there are vacant units scattered throughout this development, units which they say have been empty for years.
That apartment actually has been vacant for 5 years.
Mocha argues New York City has a housing shortage, her family is homeless, and NYC should be using its vast inventory.
So they were able to get an interview with one of the neighbors who says that the apartment that this woman found herself in was vacant for 5 years. That's a long time. Now, she was living there for 4 months, which again, she admits that she shouldn't have been doing, but the fact that this place was empty for half a decade, that is utterly ridiculous. One way of looking at this is, yes, this woman did something wrong, but on the other hand, at least somebody lived in this place for a couple of months and got off the streets for a little while. Now, of course, this is unfair to the 240,000 people who were apparently waiting for one of these apartments as of last year, but without someone forcing their way into one of these units, this story never would have made the news, and there would be no public outcry for something to be done. And this also reveals that these properties are not being run or managed by people who care if they are ever put to good use. And this is just so backwards from the way a normal apartment building is run. In a normal apartment building, if there's a vacant apartment, the landlord knows about it, the super knows about it, they know immediately when the tenant moves out, and they've got every incentive in the world to find somebody else to move in and pay the rent for that place. But here, apparently, you've got apartments that are sitting empty for half a decade, and either nobody knows or somebody does know, but nobody has any reason to find someone to live in that place. It's totally backwards. It doesn't make sense. And these are places that are set up to help the less fortunate who are waiting in line, some people for years, to try and get one of these. But look at this, even if you do get one of these coveted apartments, life is not all roses and flowers. A lot of these places have massive sudden problems, and living in them is certainly no vacation. And at this facility here, you look outside, there's not enough trash cans, there's waste all over the place. Folks shouldn't have to live like that in an apartment building, no matter what their rent is. But the city has an excuse for why they've got so many empty apartments just sitting around that nobody can live in.
The city's biggest landlord is currently carrying more than 5,600 vacancies across its portfolio. Agency officials say crews must perform repair and environmental work before safely transferring vacant units to the next tenants. Councilmember-elect.
So in defense of their 5,600 empty apartments, the city says that it's hard to renovate them, and it's a lot of work, and we're trying, and we're doing better, and then there's the environment. But a private landlord can turn around their apartments in a legal manner in just a weekend if they need to. And NYC is the biggest housing authority in North America. They're in the business of renovating apartments. They should be pretty good at it, but for some reason they're terrible at it. Maybe that's why it takes 400 days to turn these places around. That's ridiculous. Either way, what we have here is a government agency that exists to help people but isn't doing that. And this is just a total failure of management. There's really no excuse. But if you look around New York City, you'll see thousands of different buildings owned by thousands of different landlords, and some of you are probably thinking that maybe somebody out there could do a better job fixing these public housing projects. But the city's tried this, and unfortunately the problems experienced in these places, they don't go away. Instead, they just change, and then there are new problems. So these housing facilities, they've got a lot of problems, from the way that they're managed to how old they are and how many repairs they need. And the city's tried to come up with ways around this other than changing what they do internally. And some of that has involved reaching out to private management companies that have experience doing this to see if they can do a better job. And even though they've done a better job on some of the aspects of running these places, they've also been kicking more people out.
There's a super on the premises, things get resolved immediately.
Neighbors at 572 Warren Street, which is owned by the city but managed by a private company under a so-called pact agreement, say along with those recent improvements,
Maybe there is a couple more evictions. There's new people coming in
a new report, the city...
So residents who live in some of these packed properties, as they're called, these are public housing projects that have been turned over to private companies, they say that the living experience is better. Things are getting fixed faster, there's more maintenance, the buildings are better run, but they also say that they see a lot more people moving in and out of these places and that the number of evictions are much higher. Now, it's hard to tell exactly why this is happening. Is it happening because the buildings are just more efficiently run and the eviction process is more efficient as a byproduct of that? Or is what's happening in these facilities what the city's comptroller alleges after his internal investigation reveals that tenants in some of these properties are not being adequately informed of their options and their rights? Either way, something's going on because auditors found that the private companies evicted tenants from 1 out of every 200 apartments, and the normal NYCHA eviction rate is 1 out of every 866 apartments, mostly for the non-payment of rent, which makes sense. You've got to pay rent if you want to live somewhere. But on the other hand, here you have apartments that are designed for people who may be in a tough situation and may have trouble paying their rent. And it's entirely conceivable that folks living in New York City public housing might need extra assistance or extra time or extra help getting their bills together. But the fact of the matter is these evictions are happening while thousands of apartments remain empty. These are apartments that nobody can live in, and evictions are happening, forcing people to go live in homeless shelters or on the streets. But sadly, as you're about to see, even if you manage to snag one of these apartments, living in it won't be a walk in the park, that's for sure. In fact, conditions are so bad in some of these places that some of the residents might just decide to evict themselves so that they don't have to put up with what you're about to see.
Here inside NYCHA's Stuyvesant Gardens Senior Living Center, the heat is barely coming through here, and the heat that does make it through is going right through drafty windows. Neighbors here say they are frustrated. This is what you slept in last night.
Yeah.
We also found most making hot cups of tea or just running their ovens not to cook Christmas dinner.
This is a disaster. You've got people running their ovens and their stoves to try and heat their apartments because they're not warm enough in the freezing cold New York winter. That's not right. Especially when the city likes to create blog articles bragging about how they're ready for heating season and how they even state on their website the apartments have to be 68 during the day and 62 at night when it's below 55 out. What's even more maddening is that this facility on the news, it is a seniors facility. Everyone living there is of age, and extreme temperatures are going to be even harder for them to deal with. Yet every time they turn on their heat, nothing comes out, and the warmth they do have in their apartments escapes through old, drafty windows. And I hate to say this, but when you realize how bad the heating situation is in these buildings, if they can't be heated properly, moving more people into other apartments inside of them might just make the whole situation worse for everybody. And maybe that's the reason these apartments are all vacant. Maybe they can't be safely operated without dragging down the living conditions of everybody else in these buildings. Now, of course, if the buildings in question were better maintained, this wouldn't be a problem. You rarely hear about stuff like this happening in privately run buildings. And now the question is it really right for the city to be evicting people from its buildings when the conditions inside of them are so bad the people living there wish they didn't even have to, but their other option is the street?
One of the main concerns they have is the lack of clean water in their apartments. They say some of the conditions are inhumane. They have photos of different shades of water they say continue to come out of their faucets, paint in their apartments that's peeling from the walls, and...
Okay, if anyone saw that water coming out of their faucets, they would absolutely lose it. That's horrible. That could shorten someone's lifespan to have to live in a place with conditions like that. And on top of that, we're learning that when repairs are made to some of these units, the units are then unavailable for the original resident to reoccupy. That means either one of two things. Either they've been permanently evicted, which I don't think is the case. The more likely case is they've just been moved to another equally bad apartment somewhere else, and then the apartment they were in gets put up for somebody else. Either way, the people living in these places are getting totally screwed over every way possible. Finding one of these apartments is a challenge because the city is hoarding vacant units for reasons that don't make any sense. And if you do find a vacant unit to live in, well, your problems might just be getting started because the building could fall apart around you, and that's the only place the city will give you to live. And when private companies get involved and they start making repairs, yes, things get done faster, but the eviction process also happens faster, and there is contention over whether or not that's being done the right way. But one thing's for sure, if you're one of the 200,000 people who's waiting to live in one of these places and you find out that somebody isn't paying their rent and they get to stay, that's gonna feel pretty unfair to you, and you're gonna think that their eviction is justified, and it could be. But then again, the city is the one moving people into these places who they know need help, and if they're not getting it, that might not be a good thing either. What do you think about this? Should the city use these empty apartments to house the homeless like that woman who was caught squatting in one of them says they should? And what do you think they could do to get their act together and get these 5,600 apartments, a number that is growing, into the market for these affordable places so that folks can actually live in them who are struggling? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think. I'll see you in the next video.